Imagine a young nation pushing ever deeper into unknown frontiers, armed with superior weapons and driven by the promise of expansion. Most would immediately picture the United States and its march westward, displacing Native American tribes in a campaign of conquest and devastation. Yet across the icy waters of the Bering Sea, another empire was carving out its own destiny. This was not the tale of cowboys and settlers, but of Cossacks and tsars, of muskets and fur pelts, of blood spilled across endless forests. This is the story of Russia's brutal conquest of Siberia, a chapter in colonial history often overshadowed by its Western counterpart, but no less ruthless in its execution. Before we begin, take a moment to tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. It's always fascinating to see how stories of the past reach people across different places and times. When people think of colonial expansion, the image that often emerges is the westward surge of the United States, its settlers and soldiers moving across vast plains, overwhelming native nations and redrawing entire landscapes. Yet this was not a uniquely American story. Across the frozen expanse of northern Asia, Russia too embarked on a relentless push that would transform geography and humanity alike. This march eastward, across rivers and mountains, built the foundations of what became the largest country on Earth. The Russian conquest of Siberia was not a tale of accidental encounters or peaceful assimilation. It was an intentional project of domination, driven by the hunger for territory and resources, and justified through the language of empire. With muskets in their hands and the Tsar's banners fluttering above, Cossack adventurers and soldiers advanced step by step into a land already inhabited by diverse peoples. Theirs was a mission not of coexistence, but of control and extraction. What made this endeavor particularly brutal was the collision of scale and power. Siberia itself was a world beyond imagination, stretching across 13 million square kilometers, filled with taiga, tundra, and frozen rivers. Yet despite its harshness, it was not empty. Dozens of nations had thrived there for millennia, speaking their own languages, practicing their own beliefs, and shaping their lives around reindeer, rivers, and spirits of the natural world. Against them stood a centralized state willing to crush whatever stood in its way. The comparison with the American frontier is not accidental. Both expansions shared the logic of empire: displace, subdue, and exploit. Yet in Siberia, the cold itself became a weapon, a backdrop of suffering that compounded human violence. The soldiers who marched eastward were not pioneers seeking freedom, but agents of the Tsar's will, enforcing tribute and demanding obedience. The result was a story marked by shattered communities, silenced shamans, and landscapes scarred by blood and fire. And so begins the story of how Russia reached the Pacific, not as a peaceful traveler, but as a conqueror, carving an empire out of snow and suffering. The first step in this long and merciless journey was to understand the land itself, a territory whose immensity both inspired awe and demanded subjugation. As we move forward, the stage will be set upon Siberia's frozen soil, a stage where ambition and brutality played out in equal measure. The land that stretched before the Russian advance was unlike anything their empire had ever attempted to master. Siberia was not simply a territory, it was a continent within a continent, a space of overwhelming scale and extremes. From frozen tundra to endless taiga, from towering mountain ranges to marshes that swallowed entire caravans, its landscapes defied easy conquest. To march across Siberia was to challenge not only human resistance but the very elements themselves, each step a gamble against cold and distance. Yet Siberia was no empty void awaiting discovery. For millennia, human societies had carved out lives within this unforgiving geography. Dozens of nations, each speaking languages as distinct as the forests they roamed, sustained themselves through systems adapted to the environment. Communities herded reindeer across snowy plains, others fished the great rivers that cut through the land, and still others hunted in dense forests where survival required patience and reverence for the spirits believed to dwell among the trees. Spiritual life was inseparable from the land itself. The shamans of Siberia stood as intermediaries between human and nature, guardians who communed with forces in the rivers, skies, and forests. Through chants, offerings, and ritual, they gave meaning to an existence often at the edge of survival. To the Russians, such beliefs were dismissed as primitive superstitions, but for the native peoples, they were lifelines, systems of order that gave structure to life in a world that demanded resilience. This cultural mosaic was more than tradition, it was a shield. The bonds of kinship, belief, and ritual kept communities strong against hunger and isolation. And yet no shield could prepare them for the arrival of a foreign power that did not see sacred rivers but resources, that recognized no spirits in the trees but only timber to be felled, that measured worth not in ritual but in rubles. The clash between these worldviews would become as destructive as any musket or sword. Despite its remoteness, Siberia was never isolated from the wider world. Waves of conquerors had already swept through, from the horse archers of the Scythians to the Turkic Khaganates, and finally the Mongols of Chinggis Khan, each leaving behind scars of domination. By the time Russia turned its gaze eastward, the region carried layers of memory, of tribute exacted, of rebellions crushed, of the endless struggle between freedom and submission. History had hardened these societies, but the pressure of the Tsars' empire would prove to be an ordeal unlike any other. And at the heart of this conquest lay a temptation that no empire could ignore: fur. The pelts of sable, lynx, and Arctic fox glistened like currency of the natural world, coveted in the courts of Europe and Asia alike. For Moscow, these animals were not symbols of wilderness but treasures waiting to be seized. The pursuit of fur would become the spearhead of Russian expansion, a motive as relentless as the cold itself. Stay with us until the end, because the path from sacred reindeer herds to exploited fur tribute is one of the darkest transitions in colonial history. The pursuit of fur was not merely a trade, it was an obsession that reshaped empires. In Moscow, sable pelts were compared to gold, treasured as luxuries that projected status and wealth. A cloak lined with Siberian fur was more than warmth. It was a declaration of power. Foreign diplomats marveled at the richness of these garments, while merchants calculated profits that reached across Europe and Asia. For Russia, Siberia became less a wilderness and more a treasury waiting to be unlocked. To transform this vision into reality, the Tsar relied on his frontier warriors, the Cossacks. Fierce, disciplined, and opportunistic, they were the spearhead of expansion, advancing not as settlers, but as enforcers. Wherever they rode, they carried demands for yasak, the fur tribute imposed on native communities. Resistance was met with fire and musket, compliance with a system of extraction that stripped people of both wealth and dignity. The Cossacks' arrival was never a negotiation, it was a verdict. For the indigenous nations, yasak was a slow suffocation. Families who once measured prosperity in reindeer herds or sacred rituals were now forced to trap and skin animals for a distant empire. The very creatures that had once been symbols of survival became tokens of subjugation. Shamans who invoked spirits for guidance found themselves silenced by soldiers who recognized only quotas and deadlines. In this shift, culture itself became collateral damage, replaced by a ledger of fur and blood. The brutality of this system was not hidden, it was deliberate. Villages that resisted tribute were burned, leaders executed, women and children taken as hostages to ensure obedience. Each act of violence sent a message that echoed across rivers and tundra. The Tsar's will was absolute. In this way, conquest was less about open battles and more about calculated terror. Fear was a weapon sharper than any sword, binding populations to the empire without need for constant armies. Yet, even fear had its limits. Some communities fled deeper into the forests, abandoning ancestral lands to escape tribute. Others fought back in desperate uprisings, striking at outposts or ambushing small bands of soldiers. These acts, though often crushed, revealed the resilience of a people unwilling to surrender entirely. The clash between fur traders and native nations became a cycle of exploitation and defiance, each confrontation leaving scars that endured long after the smoke cleared. This cycle of tribute, violence, and resistance laid the foundation for centuries of domination. What began as a pursuit of luxury goods became a system of control that redefined an entire region. Siberia was no longer simply land, it was a colony, its people reduced to subjects of a distant throne. And while the Tsar reaped wealth from furs, the true cost was borne by those who lost their freedom and their future. If this story grips you, take a moment now to subscribe so you never miss the darker truths of history that shape the world we live in. The conquest of Siberia was not confined to fur tribute alone. As the Russians pushed farther east, the expansion became a territorial campaign that reshaped the very map of Eurasia. Each fort constructed along a river was both a symbol of power and a chain binding the land to Moscow. These wooden palisades, crude yet imposing, marked the slow tightening of an imperial grip that extended further with each passing year. For the native peoples, these forts were more than outposts. They were reminders that foreign power had arrived to stay. Trade routes, once open and communal, now passed through Russian checkpoints, where tariffs and tribute drained communities of their resources. Markets that once centered on exchange of goods between tribes were gradually replaced by dependencies on imported iron tools, alcohol, and gunpowder, each transaction deepening the loss of autonomy. The fortress was not only a military structure but an economic trap. The Russian state understood this strategy well. To dominate Siberia was not merely to control territory but to sever the ability of local societies to sustain themselves independently. By imposing trade monopolies, enforcing fur quotas, and encouraging rivalries between tribes, the empire dismantled networks of solidarity that had long held communities together. Fragmentation was a deliberate tactic. Divided peoples were easier to conquer, and economic dependency bound them to the Tsar's rule more tightly than shackles ever could. Amid this territorial advance, rivers became arteries of conquest. The great Siberian waterways, once lifelines for fishing and migration, were transformed into highways for Russian expansion. Boats carried soldiers, settlers, and supplies deep into the interior, while returning ships brought back cargoes of furs destined for Moscow and beyond. Each river that once carried spiritual significance for native societies became instead a corridor of extraction, flowing steadily with wealth toward the empire and leaving devastation in its wake. The scale of this transformation was staggering. In little more than a century, Russia had extended its frontiers thousands of miles to the Pacific, swallowing entire nations and landscapes in the process. Villages disappeared, languages were silenced, and territories that had once belonged to free peoples were absorbed into an expanding imperial mass. To the outside world, this achievement was heralded as a triumph of endurance and power. To those within Siberia, it was the slow-motion erasure of their world. It is in these erasures that the true brutality of conquest is revealed. Behind every fort, every river crossing, every trade post lay stories of families uprooted and futures stolen. Russia's march across Siberia was not destiny, but design, engineered to enrich the empire at the expense of human lives and cultures. If you believe more people should know about these overlooked chapters of history, share this story with someone who has never heard it. Let the silence of the past be broken by voices in the present. The human cost of Russia's conquest was written in silence, in the disappearance of entire nations whose names now survive only in records kept by outsiders. Disease, carried eastward by soldiers and merchants, decimated populations that had no immunity to smallpox or measles. Villages that had thrived for centuries were reduced to ashes or abandoned altogether, their rituals left unfinished, their stories interrupted. The empire gained territory, but it gained it over the graves of countless forgotten lives. Displacement became a second wave of devastation. Communities uprooted from ancestral grounds were forced into barren regions, stripped of the rivers, forests, and pastures that had sustained them for generations. The land that once nurtured their identities was handed to Russian settlers or converted into spaces of extraction. With every forced migration, traditions weakened, bonds fractured, and younger generations were severed from the places that had defined their ancestors' existence. Geography itself became a weapon. The cultural toll was no less brutal. Languages once spoken freely around hearth fires and within sacred groves fell into silence. Songs that carried centuries of memory lost their voices as children were pressed into learning Russian words instead of their own. Shamans who had once guided communities through ritual and myth were ridiculed, outlawed, or killed outright. The empire did not only seize land and labor, it seized meaning, stripping identity until survival itself seemed emptied of purpose. Accounts from the time record acts of cruelty that were as deliberate as they were systematic. Hostages taken from villages were paraded as trophies to compel obedience. Women were violated as warnings to others. Men who resisted were executed publicly, their deaths staged to instill terror. Such spectacles were not random outbreaks of violence, but strategies designed to engrave fear into the collective memory of surviving communities. Conquest was enforced not only with steel, but with humiliation. And yet, in the shadow of this violence, resistance endured. Small bands of fighters ambushed patrols, villages sheltered fugitives, and rituals were carried out in secret to preserve the old ways. Even as Moscow proclaimed dominion, the persistence of defiance reminded the empire that it had not fully erased its subjects. These flashes of courage, though often crushed, carried the embers of dignity through centuries of oppression, a testament that conquest could wound but not wholly annihilate the human spirit. Such resilience, however, came at immeasurable cost. Generations lived with trauma, their collective pasts scarred by dispossession and fear. The Russian Empire expanded, but its triumphs were paid for with broken families, silenced languages, and stolen futures. To understand Siberia today is to acknowledge these buried histories and refuse to let them vanish unspoken. If this story has moved you, leave a comment sharing your thoughts. Not only does it help others discover this history, it ensures these voices are not lost to silence again. The conquest of Siberia did more than expand borders. It reshaped Russia's identity as an empire. By the 17th century, Moscow had ceased to be a regional power and transformed into a continental behemoth. The sheer scale of its dominion inspired awe and fear in equal measure. To rule from the Baltic to the Pacific was not only a geographic accomplishment but a political statement. Russia would not be contained by nature, rivals, or distance. This transformation carried with it a narrative of inevitability carefully cultivated by the state. Chronicles described Siberia as an empty land, downplaying the peoples who had lived there for centuries. Imperial rhetoric painted conquest as destiny, framing expansion as the natural order of things. By erasing native presence from its official story, Russia legitimized violence and made erasure itself part of its governing logic. The myth of emptiness became a tool sharper than any blade. The empire's new wealth reinforced this image of inevitability. Furs flowed westward into Moscow, filling treasuries and adorning courts, while territorial victories elevated the Tsar's prestige abroad. Diplomats from Europe marveled at Russia's reach, even as they feared its ambitions. Within its borders, however, the story was different. What looked like prosperity for the crown meant exploitation for its subjects. The riches of Siberia were celebrated in palaces while hunger lingered in villages. This duality hardened Russia's governing style. Expansion through conquest became an expectation, a measure of strength that each ruler felt compelled to uphold. Siberia had proven that harsh lands could be subdued and harsh peoples broken. That lesson extended outward, to Poland, to Central Asia, to the Caucasus. The conquest of Siberia was not a closed chapter, but a template, a rehearsal for future imperial projects that would follow the same script of domination and suppression. The consequences for Russia itself were profound. The empire stretched thin across impossible distances, ruling over dozens of cultures it barely understood. Its power rested on coercion rather than trust, on forts and tribute rather than cooperation. In this way, Siberia became both triumph and burden. The conquest that enlarged Russia's borders also deepened its reliance on force, planting the seeds of unrest that would one day challenge the empire from within. And so Siberia was not merely conquered, it was absorbed into the very psychology of Russian power. It became proof that empire could be built through cruelty and sustained through fear. Yet, every act of domination left behind a wound that history has not healed. To grasp this legacy is to see how conquest shapes conquerors as much as the conquered. If you want to continue uncovering these uncomfortable truths of empire, give this video a like. Each gesture helps keep these difficult stories alive. The scars left by Russia's conquest of Siberia did not fade with time. They deepened across generations. Indigenous nations that survived the initial violence carried the trauma of loss in every ritual and story that remained. Their languages, once vibrant with myths and oral traditions, became fragmented echoes spoken in whispers. The landscape itself, stripped of meaning, stood as a silent witness to how entire worlds can vanish while the empire celebrated its own triumph. For Russia, the vast new territory became both a blessing and a curse. Siberia provided immense resources, furs, timber, later gold and minerals that strengthened the empire's grip on global trade. Yet managing such an expanse required constant suppression of unrest and relentless exploitation of labor. The costs of control drained resources, demanded armies, and sowed resentment even among settlers who had been promised prosperity, but instead found hardship in hostile lands. The indigenous peoples endured waves of assimilation that sought to erase their cultures more thoroughly than muskets ever had. Missionaries spread Christianity by denouncing local spirits as demons, while schools imposed Russian language and identity. Generations of children grew up estranged from the traditions of their ancestors, trapped between two worlds yet belonging fully to neither. Assimilation, cloaked as civilization, functioned as a subtler but equally devastating form of conquest. By the 19th century, Siberia was no longer just a colony, it had become a prison. The empire began sending political dissidents, criminals, and undesirables into exile across the icy expanse. Settlements grew not only from conquest but from punishment, turning Siberia into a land synonymous with suffering in the Russian imagination. What had begun as conquest for fur ended as a system of exile where the empire buried both its victims and its rebels. The legacy of conquest persisted into modern times. Even today, many indigenous communities across Siberia struggle with poverty, marginalization, and the lingering effects of cultural erasure. Their voices are rarely heard in the grand narrative of Russian history, which still tends to celebrate expansion as destiny rather than acknowledge it as dispossession. The empire's triumphal story hides wounds that remain unhealed, a silence as vast as the land itself. To remember this history is to confront the reality that empire thrives on forgetting. By recalling the stories of those who resisted, suffered, and endured, we resist the myth of inevitability that still surrounds Russian expansion. History is not destiny, it is choice, and it is memory. If you believe these stories deserve to reach a wider audience, turn on the notification bell. That way you'll never miss when we bring hidden truths of the past into the light. The conquest of Siberia was not only a local tragedy, but a global lesson in how empires disguise brutality as destiny. The narrative of Russia's eastward march has long been framed as triumph over nature, a saga of courage against cold and wilderness. Yet beneath that veneer lies a darker truth. The empire's strength was purchased by silencing nations, erasing languages, and treating human lives as expendable in the pursuit of wealth and territory. This truth forces us to reconsider the meaning of power. Conquest is often celebrated as progress, but its legacy is rarely progress for those who lived under its shadow. For the native Siberians, expansion meant displacement, humiliation, and loss. For Russia, it created the illusion of invincibility while embedding reliance on violence and control. Empires rarely see how the instruments of conquest abroad become chains binding their own future at home. History is not a dead record, but a living echo. The scars of Siberia resonate in the modern world, where resource extraction still drives conflicts and indigenous peoples continue to fight for recognition. The story of Siberia reminds us that erasure is not unique to the past. It is a danger that lurks whenever ambition outweighs humanity. To forget these lessons is to risk repeating them under new banners and in new lands. By examining this history, we confront uncomfortable questions. What is the cost of greatness? Can expansion ever be separated from exploitation? And how many nations celebrated today as powerful stand upon foundations built from suffering? The answers are not simple, but they are essential. For in the silence of erased voices lies the permission for future empires to commit the same crimes again. The conquest of Siberia demonstrates that domination is never clean, never righteous. It poisons the land it claims and corrupts the power that wields it. Empires fall, but the damage they inflict lingers, shaping lives long after their banners have vanished. Russia's story in Siberia is both cautionary and universal, warning us that the pursuit of endless expansion carries with it endless consequences. And so, as we reflect on this tale of frozen frontiers and shattered nations, the question is left for us. What lessons will we carry forward? History's shadows remain until they are named, understood, and shared. If this journey has resonated with you, share your perspective in the comments. Let us know what this story awakens in you, and together we ensure these voices are not lost again. The story of Russia's conquest of Siberia began with fire and steel, but it ends with memory. The empire that claimed to bring order to a wilderness instead left behind wounds that outlived its rulers. Villages destroyed, voices silenced, and lands stripped bare became the foundation of Moscow's glory. What was hailed as victory for the empire was, for countless others, the unending sorrow of erasure. Memory is the only battlefield that remains. To understand this conquest is to see empire unmasked. Behind banners and rhetoric lies a machinery that consumes without conscience, reducing humans to resources and landscapes to trophies. Siberia was not tamed, it was broken. Its conquest reveals the cost of ambition unchecked, ambition that values territory above dignity, wealth above life. The echoes of these choices reverberate, for history does not remain in the past. It lingers, shaping present identities and future paths. The Russian Empire believed it had triumphed, but conquest is never final. Every attempt to erase culture leaves behind fragments that resist. Songs whispered in secret, rituals carried in memory, stories retold despite prohibition. All these become seeds of endurance. Empires can burn villages and silence languages, but they cannot wholly extinguish the human will to remember. Siberia's survival lies not in maps, but in the persistence of its people. For Russia itself, the conquest carried consequences it could not escape. By relying on violence and fear, the empire forged habits of control that shaped its governance for centuries. The methods first tested in Siberia became patterns repeated in Poland, the Caucasus, and beyond. The legacy of expansion was not only domination of others, but also dependency on coercion, a cycle that destabilized the empire even as it appeared to strengthen it. The lesson of Siberia is both specific and universal. It shows that empires rise not through destiny, but through decisions often written in cruelty. It shows that wealth built on exploitation is never secure, for it carries within it the seeds of collapse. And it shows that silence is complicity, that only by remembering can we prevent repetition. To forget is to grant empires the victory they never fully achieved. And so this tale closes not with triumph, but with a warning. The conquest of Siberia was brutal, relentless, and destructive, yet its memory carries power for us today. In remembering, we resist erasure. In telling these stories, we restore dignity to voices once silenced. If this journey has stayed with you, consider sharing this video widely, so that history's shadows are not left to gather dust in silence, but are brought into the light for all to see.